George Cohn here from the Lest We Forget World War II Museum in Lewisville, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, sit right back and I'll tell you a little tale. My dad was in the Texas 36th Infantry Division in Africa and Italy. And ever since I was a little kid, I've had this fascination with World War II. I mean, little kid. I played with G.I. Joes and watched all the Army movies I could, Combat and Hogan's Heroes, Rat Patrol. So my dad didn't like to talk about it, and I was quite the pest, I'm sure, asking him questions and showing him stuff. I can remember bringing home a German helmet and showing it to him, and he got mad at me. He said, "Get that piece of shit out of here. I saw so many dead guys wearing those on the side of the road. I can't stand to see it." "Yes, sir," and I took the helmet away and I hid it in my room. And a couple of weeks later, he said, "You still have that German helmet?" "Yes, sir." Bring it here." And he held it and looked at it for about 5 minutes. And then he said, "That sure is heavy. Get it out of here." And I hid it, and that's 40 years ago. And now it's stuck away in that cabinet right there. So my dad didn't like to talk about the war, and he wouldn't go to the reunions. So after my dad died, I decided to start going to his 36th Division reunions to meet men that he knew. And when I would walk in the door, guys from his outfit would look at me, and they'd look me up and down, and they'd say, "Are you Sergeant Cohn's boy?" Because I look like him in the face, but I'm quite smaller than he is. He was a big guy, 6'4" and 240, and I didn't get any of that. So yes, sir. So they'd tell me stories about my dad. One guy told me, "Your father did the work of 2 men." And as I knew him, my dad always worked. As a kid, my whole life, my dad came home from work and he helped my mom with dinner and the dishes, and he was always working in the yard and fixing something. Another guy told me, he said, "Your dad read the Bible every night." And I said, "Yes, sir, I know that. My dad, when I grew up, my father, after dinner, sat in his gold chair and read the Bible to himself for about 10 or 15 minutes before he would turn on the TV or pick up the newspaper." And so I relayed that to the man, and the man squeezed my shoulder real tight, and he says, "No, son, you don't understand. I'm telling you, in the combat zone, your dad read the Bible every night." Attending these reunions, the men were telling me their stories, and then they were telling me about how their wives were throwing away their souvenirs. So at that point, I started getting serious about trying to collect the souvenirs to save the memories of World War II. I got invited to a German paratrooper reunion in Braunschweig, and I think it was like 1990, if my memory serves me correctly. And a long story short, I met some very nice German paratroopers there, and I got in a fist fight at the graveyard because left-wing German youth were attacking the old men, and I stood in between them, and it was a strange deal. But afterwards, they wrote about it in the newspaper, and some lady sent it to me, and her husband wanted to talk to me, and his name was Klaus Voss. He was a tanker in the Feldherrnhalle Division, 106th Panzer Brigade. And we became friends. He published a story in the Kamerad, the German veteran magazine. He invited me to a German tanker reunion. And I went to the German tanker reunion, the Panzertreffen at Münster in the Panzergelände. And it was quite an interesting deal. I met a ton of German veterans, and I was fortunate enough to interview a lot of them. I sought out guys that fought my dad. I would go into the little classrooms where they were having the reunion, Hermann Göring division's meeting here, 16th Panzer's meeting here, la-di-da. So I'd go in and I'd ask them if anybody was at Salerno. When they'd raise their hand, I'd go over and ask them for their address and if I could interview them. So I traveled around Germany interviewing German vets for a couple of years. I lived in America, and I would go over periodically a few times a year for a couple of years to interview German vets. And one of the gentlemen that I met at the tanker reunion was, currently he was a Oberst, he was colonel, but when he fought my dad at Salerno, he was a first lieutenant, Oberleutnant Christian von Lucke, 2nd Regiment of the 16th Panzer Division. He was the adjutant, and he told me that they had received the night before the invasion the code word Ernte einbringen, which means reap the harvest, and that meant to disarm the Italians, that the Allies were coming and they were not to trust the Italians. He talked about how bitter that was, having to disarm their former allies. In any event, Christian von Lucke was a Panzer IV commander in the 2nd Regiment, 16th Panzer Division. He had 11 tanks knocked out from underneath him during the war. He went from Poland to Silesia at the very end. He was at Stalingrad where his brother was killed, and he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. When he died, his daughter sent me his medals that were left over from the war. When I would go to his house and interview him, he would always empty out this little lunch sack that had his medals in it. Iron Cross First Class, Second Class, Wounded Badge, and a Panzer Kampfabzeichen with the number 25 on it. And I made a big deal about the number 25, and he said, "Oh, that's nothing. One of my friends has 75. And then he made it clear to me, Christian did, that the number 25 doesn't mean skirmishes or battles that you're in. It's pre-planned attacks that are scheduled days before that are then carried out. He said, counterattacks or anything like that, they're not included in the number on your Panzer badge. Christian von Lucke told me that they got to the beaches at Paestum, where the 36th invaded. A week before, he said they'd cut down trees and made fields of fire, and he said they made preparations to take over the Italian positions, which they did. And this is typical of what the German soldier would have looked like at Salerno. He's wearing tropical garb, and yet he's on the mainland, but these guys are in a very warm climate, southern Italy, in September, still pretty hot. What I love about the German uniform is the swastika with the eagle, and then around it says, Gott mit uns, God with us. Isn't that interesting? Another fellow from Germany in the Hermann Göring division was Hilmar Lotz. He was wounded in Africa, and he fought my dad at Salerno. He was at Monte Cassino. I remember him telling me that when he saw the American prisoners and dead, that they had rubber on the soles of their boots, he knew they were in trouble because the Germans didn't have any source for rubber. It was a very rare commodity for them. American guys I interviewed, one guy that sticks out is Colonel Ed Sayer. At the time, he was a captain, A Company commander, 505 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne. He was under Jim Gavin. And when they jumped at Sicily, he was the only unit to land on their drop zone, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by General Ridgway because he achieved the regimental objective before noon on D-Day at Sicily, July 10, 43. He was at Salerno. He had some great stories. Another guy was Fred Baldino. He was a paratrooper in the 504 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne. He told me about being up on Hill 424. He said when they jumped, he said they landed pretty close to the beach and they were put in trucks and driven to the bottom of the mountain. And they scaled the mountain. Hill 424, which was the commanding heights of Salerno. It went back and forth between the Texans and the Germans 5 times before they dropped the 82nd Airborne. And when those guys took that hill, they never gave it up. I remember him talking about they were ascending the hill and there was a tree, and he said he and one buddy went to the left, and another guy, they nicknamed him Country Club Johnson or something like that, because the guy always talked about golf. He said he went to the right, and a mortar landed on the right side of that tree and killed him. And he said, it's just such luck. If I would have gone to the right behind Johnson instead of the left behind so-and-so, he said, I would have got it too. He talked about being on the top of Hill 424 and how they could see the German coal scuttle helmets bouncing around, coming up the hill, and they were shooting the Germans in the head because they could see those helmets popping around. And then he talked about a German guy that was in their outfit. He was a German that lived in America and was in the American military, but he could speak German, and he started calling out commands to the German soldiers that were attacking them, which is directing them, ordering them to move into positions where they were in the field of fire, where they could drop mortars on them or hit them with small arms. Pretty incredible. Over here, a couple other guys that would have been at Salerno. The German tankers, as I mentioned before, the 2nd Regiment of the 16th Panzers were there waiting. There were other Panzer units that arrived later. There was multiple divisions that showed up that encircled the Texans, not to let them out. Here's a typical tanker. And then here we have a paratrooper. So the German paratroopers were wearing tropical when they were at Salerno. They fought quite a bit in Battipaglia, which was against the British, but I believe that they did skirmish some against the Texans. And you'll see here we have a lieutenant, a lieutenant, a tropical German paratrooper armed with a PPK and an MP40. And down at his feet we have an MG34, which is quite an impressive weapon. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. None of the guns here work. They're all, this is a real gun, but the receiver's a dummy, and that's just a toy. And there's nothing in here. But this is a great German paratrooper helmet. And this hat here was given to me by Buddy Sinclair, who was in the Texas 36th Infantry Division. I want to say he was in the 142nd. And he told me that he took that hat out of a seat of a German bomber when they overran an airfield. I don't know where, but it's got the guy's name and serial number and all that inside of it. Helma Shaya, if I remember correctly. But here we have an Unteroffizier Panzer, tropical, smoking the ubiquitous cigarette, probably American that they've captured. And ladies and gentlemen, over here we have the standard GI, what the GI looked like in Africa and Italy. This is what the guys in the Texas 36th Division would have looked like. If you come around here, you can see his flash when they hit the beach at Salerno. And on the 13th of September, on the 9th of September is when we hit the beach. And on the 13th, the 82nd Airborne started dropping in to assist them. The 504, the 509, and the 505 all dropped. The 509 got scattered behind the lines badly. But it was the 504 that went up to Alta Villa and that held it. As I understand it, they called in shipboard artillery on their own position because the Germans were overrunning them. But they held that position, which was the commanding heights.